Elon Musk wants a million-person colony on Mars by 2050, and his company SpaceX is building a revolutionary new rocket to get us there. But how realistic is it to expect humans to get to Mars within a decade? Even at its closest approach, Mars is over 140 times further than the Moon, and we haven't been back there in over 50 years. But did you know it takes less propellant to get to Mars than to the Moon? How's that possible? Stick around to find out. One-way travel to Mars can last between 120 to 430 days. Stay times are a minimum of 30 to 550 days, and returning home can require flying past Venus. Why is there such a variance in stay times and transit lengths? And how do we choose between these different mission architectures? Why can't we get to Mars faster? And what will it be like to aerobrake in the Martian atmosphere? In my previous video, it was shown why Mars is the destination of choice for future colonization efforts. But today, we'll discuss the nuances of planning a trip to Mars and follow Starship step by step through its journey to the Red Planet. I'm Will, and this is Mars Matters.
Mars Matters.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. Mars is far away. Really far away. Light takes 3 minutes to get from Earth to Mars on closest approach, but getting humans there requires traveling 400 million kilometers on a curving arc around the Sun. For comparison, the Moon's only 400,000 kilometers away, so you have to travel 1,000 times further to get to Mars. It took 3 days for the Apollo astronauts to reach the Moon, so would it take 3,000 days to reach Mars? Thankfully, no. The Apollo astronauts traveled between the Earth and Moon at a geocentric velocity of 1.5 kilometers per second. This velocity wasn't set by the constraints of the rocket technology at the time, but instead by the mission geometry. The Saturn V could have rocketed the Apollo astronauts to the Moon at 3 times that speed to reach the Moon in a single day, but there would have been a price to pay. They wouldn't have been able to stop. The Moon has a relatively weak gravity and no atmosphere to slow down against, so the Apollo missions had to rely entirely on propulsive deceleration. Mars, on the other hand, has a substantial gravitational pull as well as an atmosphere, both of which can assist in facilitating a deceleration maneuver. This means a spacecraft can reach Mars with a much greater approach velocity and still manage to capture into orbit and land. More importantly though, a spacecraft leaving Earth's sphere of influence can benefit from an extra boost of 30 kilometers per second due to Earth's orbit around the Sun. So, although Mars is much further than the Moon, we can travel there at 20 times the speed. The journey still takes much longer though, and requires significant planning. Keep in mind that Earth and Mars are constantly changing their positions relative to each other. This means you have to launch at the right time, known as a launch window, to ensure Mars will be there to greet you when you arrive at its orbit. When exactly a launch window occurs depends on the specifics of your mission architecture, but in general, a launch window to Mars opens every 26 months. When planning a round-trip mission, there are basically 2 different flight plans, known as the long-stay conjunction mission and the short-stay opposition mission. Let's take a look at the pros and cons of each. The long-stay mission is the lowest energy mission to Mars, especially when a home-in transfer is used on the way there and back. A home-in transfer is an orbital maneuver that typically requires the least energy to change orbits around the central body. The right time to launch for a home-in transfer to Mars is just before closest approach, when the phase angle is 44 degrees. The home-in transfer takes 260 days to get to Mars, and leads to a stay on the planet of 500 days. After spending another 260 days in space on the way home, the total time spent away from Earth is approximately 1,020 days. That's almost 3 years. Given such a long total mission duration, some of the more risk-averse voices at NASA prefer the short-stay mission, since it reduces the total mission duration to just under 2 years. To make this possible, the outbound leg of the journey uses additional propellant to get to Mars in just 180 days. Once there, instead of waiting 500 days for a minimum energy launch window back to Earth, the return home begins after only 30 days on the surface. Since Earth and Mars aren't yet in optimal positions, the return journey has to fly by Venus to get a gravitational slingshot back to Earth. This results in a return journey lasting 430 days. But since significantly less time was spent on Mars, the total mission duration is still a few hundred days shorter. That being said, it's been argued by many that the advantages of a shorter mission duration are overshadowed by the significant reduction in time spent on Mars, the increased time spent in transit, and the much larger propulsive requirements needed to fly by Venus.
It's ironic that the main perceived benefit of the short-stay mission is safety, when in fact the long transit times maximize the risks associated with space radiation, zero gravity, and transit life support systems. Being closer to the Sun during the Venus flyby will add extra strain on the heat control systems, and the extra velocity from the slingshot maneuver will make aerobraking in the Earth's atmosphere a lot more dangerous. Not only does a short-stay mission expose the astronauts to the greatest in-space risks, the larger propulsive requirement results in a transit vehicle with the least mass budget to put towards system redundancy. If you're looking for reasonable propulsive requirements, a long stay on the Martian surface, and short transit times, there's a third option to consider.
With a little extra propulsion during transit, the travel time of the long-stay mission can be dropped from 260 to 180 days or less for each leg of the journey. This results in a Mars stay time of 550 days and a total mission duration of about 910 days. This long-stay 6-month transit architecture is strongly favored for human missions, since it minimizes crew exposure to the in-space environment while maximizing the surface stay time and keeping propulsive requirements within reason. For cargo, the 9-month Hohmann transfer is favored, being the cheapest and allowing for the largest cargo capacity.
It all sounds straightforward in theory, but how would these transits actually be performed in practice? What maneuvers would be required? How much propellant would be needed? And could a fully functioning Starship actually take us to Mars? To answer these questions, let's go on a journey to Mars together, from Earth launch to Martian landing using SpaceX's Starship as our vehicle. But before we go anywhere, we'll need to understand an important concept in spacecraft flight dynamics, known as delta V.
Delta V is a measure of the amount of effort needed to perform an orbital maneuver. Defined literally, it means change in velocity, and it's often expressed in kilometers per second. Despite its literal definition, the delta V required for a maneuver can sometimes be larger than the actual change in velocity that occurs. For example, the velocity a rocket needs to enter a stable low Earth orbit is 7.8 kilometers per second. But when launched from Earth's surface, it can take a delta V of 9.4 kilometers per second to achieve that velocity. The difference is due to variables like atmospheric and gravitational drag during ascent, which require additional propulsion to overcome.
The main takeaway is the more delta V a maneuver requires, the more energy is needed to perform it. So during mission planning, it's a good idea to minimize delta V where possible.
With this in mind, we'll want to begin our journey to Mars by launching eastward from a launch pad near the equator. By doing so, we can get a free delta V of 0.5 kilometers per second from the rotation of the Earth. Let's assume that SpaceX's Super Heavy booster can put Starship into low Earth orbit with 100 metric tons of cargo. When fully fueled in low Earth orbit, Starship is capable of sending 100 tons of cargo to Mars. But fully fueled, it would weigh too much for the Super Heavy booster to lift to orbit. This means the tanks have to be filled in orbit by a second Starship, which is specifically designed to deliver propellant in space. Since Starship's tanks can hold 1,200 tons of propellant, Elon estimates it'll require 8 additional launches to fill them if 150 tons of propellant can be delivered at a time. Fun fact about propellant usage.
On a direct trip from Earth to Mars, simply getting from the launch pad to low Earth orbit requires using 80% or more of the propellant that will be needed for the entire mission. The rest of the 400 million kilometer journey can then be accomplished with the remaining 20%. That's like using the majority of your car's gas tank to leave the driveway and then coasting across the country on fumes. This is made possible due to the fact that there's no friction in space. So once you get moving, you can maintain your velocity without the need for additional energy. As Robert Heinlein once said, once you're in orbit, you're halfway to anywhere. Anyway, let's get back to Starship's journey to Mars.
Once we're fully fueled in a low Earth parking orbit, the next step is to fire the engines again to achieve a hyperbolic orbit to escape the Earth's sphere of influence. The burn has to occur at the right time in the orbit to propel us in the same direction the Earth is orbiting the Sun. This way, our velocity upon escape can be added to the Earth's orbital velocity as opposed to subtracted from it. The burn to achieve Earth escape velocity from low Earth orbit requires a delta V of 3.2 kilometers per second. But this velocity isn't enough to get to Mars. Escape velocity alone would leave us orbiting the Sun right next to Earth. We'll need a small additional boost beyond escape velocity to climb higher in the Sun's gravity well and reach Mars's orbit, where, if we planned everything out properly, Mars will be waiting for us. From low Earth orbit, it takes 3.6 kilometers per second to get on a 9-month trajectory toward Mars, and on arrival, another 6 to capture into orbit, lower the orbit, and land softly on the surface. To get on a trajectory toward the Moon from low Earth orbit requires a delta V of 3.1 kilometers per second, and then another 2.5 to capture into orbit, lower the orbit, and land. Therefore, a total delta V of 9.6 kilometers per second is needed to get from low Earth orbit to Mars, but only 5.6 is needed to get to the Moon.
When fully fueled in low Earth orbit with 100 metric tons of cargo, Starship only has a delta V potential of 6.9 kilometers per second. So since Mars requires 9.6 kilometers per second, how is Starship supposed to get to Mars?
Keep in mind that delta V depicts how much energy is required to get from one location to another, but it doesn't specify where that energy has to come from. The final leg of the journey to Mars may require a delta V of 6 kilometers per second to slow down, but only 1 kilometer per second of that needs to be provided by Starship's engines. The planet's gravity and atmosphere can be used to provide a free source of delta V, with the gravity helping to capture into orbit, and friction with the atmosphere providing the energy needed to lower the orbit and decelerate for landing. We do still need 1 kilometer per second of delta V to be provided by our engines though, since even a perfect aerobraking maneuver can only slow us down to the planet's terminal velocity. Step 3. Aerobraking and landing. Despite having less gravity, the thin atmosphere on Mars results in a terminal velocity 5 times higher than on Earth, which means the landing burn has to be approximately 5 times longer. Even so, by using the Martian atmosphere to slow down, our engines only have to provide 14 kilometers per second of delta V to get to Mars. The Moon doesn't have an atmosphere to slow down against, so getting there would require the engines to provide the full 15 kilometers per second of delta V needed for the mission. So this is why it takes less propellant to get to Mars.
When using friction in a planet's atmosphere to slow down, it's necessary to strike a balance between your current speed and the density of the atmosphere you're aerobraking in. The faster you're traveling, the thinner the atmosphere needs to be to prevent overheating. Only once you've slowed down can you afford to sink deeper into the planet's atmosphere where the air is more dense.
Aerobraking in the Martian atmosphere is a unique challenge, not just because the atmosphere is thin, but also because the planet's smaller. Atmospheres are spherical, so from the ship's perspective, they appear to curve away from you as you travel in a straight line. On Mars, the smaller size of the planet means the curve of the atmosphere is much tighter. If Starship can't follow the curve when aerobraking, then it'll gain altitude, where it won't be able to generate sufficient lift or drag. This will result in it flying past the planet without stopping. It may seem strange that a lack of lift would cause Starship to gain altitude, when a lack of lift for an airplane would result in it losing altitude. The difference is, an airplane uses lift to offset the pull of gravity, whereas Starship plans to come in upside down so that way the lift generated can supplement the pull of gravity. SpaceX has provided a visualization of Starship using lift to stay on course, where the lift vector points downwards, toward the planet, to help follow the curve of the atmosphere. Starship is relatively high drag for the amount of lift it generates, so there's an upper limit to how much lift it can produce without creating too much drag. Higher drag means higher heat and structural loads, which could easily lead to vehicle failure. With Mars, it's particularly challenging to maintain a balance between lift, drag, heat shield load, and structural load. If Starship aerobrakes too high in the atmosphere, it won't be able to generate enough lift to follow the curvature of the planet, and will fail to capture into orbit. But if it aerobrakes too low, it will burn up or break up in the atmosphere. On Earth, the curve of the atmosphere is much shallower, and the helping hand of gravity is stronger, so Starship can more easily stay at the optimal altitude to minimize peak heating and structural loads.
In summary, although it takes more energy to get to Mars and to the Moon, it actually takes less propellant thanks to the clever use of aerobraking in the Martian atmosphere. The trajectory you take can have a large impact on your approach velocity though, so let's see how fast we can get to Mars before aerobraking becomes too difficult.
A typical Hohmann transfer to Mars begins with a heliocentric velocity of 33 kilometers per second, but as a spacecraft climbs the sun's gravity well, it slows down to only 21 kilometers per second. Mars orbits the sun at 24 kilometers per second, so the spacecraft has to approach from the front and let Mars catch up to it. The difference in velocity between the spacecraft and Mars, known as the approach velocity, is what has to be corrected for by the aerobraking maneuver. In this case, a Hohmann transfer leads to an atmospheric entry at 3 kilometers per second. As discussed, the average Hohmann transfer to Mars requires 260 days to accomplish. You could get to Mars in just 180 days by traveling 1 kilometer per second faster. Or with even more propulsion, you could get there in as little as 120 days, but this extra velocity makes it harder to land safely on arrival. You might think the extra velocity would make it easier to land on Mars, since on arrival your speed would be more similar to Mars's. But faster routes to Mars actually lead to larger approach velocities. This is because the Hohmann transfer to Mars is unique in the fact that the velocity vectors of the spacecraft and Mars are pointing in the same direction when they meet in Mars's orbit. On shortened transits, the velocity vectors point in slightly different directions, and this difference increases the more the trip is shortened.
Even a slight angle can make a huge difference when dealing with velocities above 20 kilometers per second. So the more you shorten your transit to Mars, the faster your approach velocity becomes and the more difficult it is to aerobrake safely.
SpaceX's Starship is designed to survive Mars entry at 7.5 kilometers per second. Should a desired transit length lead to an approach velocity larger than this, there are two options. The transit can be adjusted to more closely resemble a Hohmann transfer, which will lengthen the travel time but reduce the approach velocity, or a propulsive maneuver can be used on Mars arrival to slow down to 7.5 kilometers per second before entering the atmosphere. Slowing down propulsively on arrival would require bringing significant amounts of additional propellant, which would drastically reduce the mission's cargo capacity. The most efficient way to slow down propulsively is with staging, where excess ship components are discarded before landing and only the essentials are brought to the planet. By reducing the mass of the lander this way, a small amount of propellant can accomplish large velocity changes. Staging during Mars arrival won't be an option for Starship though, since it plans to be 100% reusable. The time frames and delta-v figures used in this video are averages for the purpose of illustrating the basic differences between mission architectures. In reality, the characteristics of a journey to Mars are slightly different for every launch window, since the orbits of Earth and Mars are different in their eccentricities and inclinations. For long-stay missions, there's a cycle that roughly repeats every 15 years, such that every 7th launch window has approximately the same characteristics. The short-stay mission requires a Venus flyby to get home, so its characteristics are much less consistent between launch windows and can't be predicted by the 15-year cycle. In general though, it can be said that the 6-month fast transit long-stay mission to Mars provides the best combination of variables for human missions, while the 9-month Hohmann transfer is the best choice for cargo. Importantly, both of these missions will be able to be accomplished for a relatively low cost once SpaceX's Starship is up and running.
But how would 6 months of space radiation and microgravity affect future Martian colonists? And what can we do to mitigate these risks? If you find yourself asking these questions, consider subscribing to my channel, since my next video will cover the health effects of the journey to Mars and look at the technologies required to keep people alive en route. If you like this video, consider giving it a like, since it'll help me a lot with the algorithm and it lets me know I'm doing a good job. What gets you excited about the future of humans in space? And are there any other Mars-related topics you'd like me to cover? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, stay curious about Mars Matters.